In this lesson, we'll be creating an animated loop using the shader effector in MoGraph. Let's open up Cinema 4D. I've saved my project file as animation01. I'm going to check my project settings to make sure that they're set correctly before I start animating. Now if I select on the Object tab over here and then press Ctrl D, that's going to bring up my project settings down here. Because I'm in the UK, I'm going to work with 25 frames per second. And I want my animation to be 7 seconds long. In my timeline down here, I'm going to say 7 times 25. And that's going to give me 175 frames in my timeline. So MoGraph is a procedural modeling and animation module inside Cinema 4D. And I'm going to be showing you a quick and easy way of creating animated loops using the shader effector inside the MoGraph module. So with our fracture object selected, I'm going to head to the MoGraph tab and go to Effectors, Shader Effector. And by default, in the Parameter tab, the scale is ticked on, so I'm just going to turn that off. Now with the shader selector selected, I'm going to select on Position. And like what we had in the random effector, I'm going to add to the Z position. The object is reacting as one piece rather than separate pieces, and that's because there isn't any information inside the shader effector as yet to tell MoGraph to move the individual objects at different heights. So we need to do that by heading over to our shader effector, and I'm going to add a noise to our shader. So now already you can see the effect that that's had, and we've got some of the shapes at different heights. Selecting on the image of the noise shader here, we've got different options. So we've got seed, which you can run through and you can see the effect of. It's just changing how the noise appears. You've got different noise types. Got different octaves, so the level of detail in the noise. Scale. And you've also got some other options down here, which I'm going to talk through. Take this back and set this to noise and just the global scale to 100. The first thing I want to show is we've got some different clipping options. That's giving us different types of contrast in our image. So the closer we bring this to 50%, the low and high clipping, the more contrast that's going to give us. And the next thing I want to show you is the animation speed, because at the moment, if we play this in the timeline, nothing changes. I'm going to select on my Mo selection and on the fracture pressing Shift, and I'm actually going to add this little guy to the selection. So if I press that, that's going to disappear now. Going back to the shader effector, I'm going to add some animation to the noise. So if I just put 1 in and then press play, we've already got animation, but it's not looping. When we hit 175 frames, it pops back to a different seed. So what we need to do is add a loop period, and our film is 7 seconds long, so I'm going to add 7 to that. When we get to 175 frames, it loops seamlessly. And that's because the noise over here is actually looping. Just press right click on it and press animate, and you can actually see what the noise is doing. Maybe make high and low clipping 55. I might actually make the Z position a little bit less because I feel like the elements are going quite high. So if I go back to my shader effector into parameter, I'm going to make this 50s. You can also see some of the shapes are actually moving as groups. And I think that's because of the way the noise over the shader effector is kind of interacting with the individual objects. I feel like we need a little bit more randomness. If we go to fracture object and go to our effectors, we can see the hierarchy of the effectors at the moment. So we've got a random effector and the hide selected. We could put the hide selected above just for now. MoGraph is saying hide the objects that we don't want to show, those little glitches, so that's good. Now the random effector isn't actually on at the moment, so we could turn that on. And now you can see that that's actually changed that group. So that was actually reacting as one group before, so I can turn the random effector off and show you. But now when we turn the random effector on, that's actually treating that as 3 separate pieces. So that's a lot more useful. So you can see if I put the random above the shader, MoGraph is saying I'm going to use the random effector first, then I'm going to use the noise to change the design. Let's create a hardware render to see how it's playing back in real time. I'm just going to go to my render settings and select hardware render. Then in format, I'm going to select MP4 and I'm just going to drop it on the desktop for now. In my output, I'm just going to keep it set to 1280 by 720. I'm going to change the frame rate to 25 frames per second, and I'm going to select all frames. Now if we go to render to picture viewer, and head to the desktop, we can see how that's actually playing in real time. Because sometimes the scene's quite heavy in cinema, it won't actually play in real time. Could probably slow it down a touch, but let's leave it as is. So the next thing I'm going to do is extend the design because I don't want all this empty space. Introduce some cameras. We want to be able to get down here and get a bit of depth and actually have our design in the background here animating. So in order to do that, I'm actually going to use a cloner object. So if I select MoGraph again, I'm going to go to cloner object and I'm going to drag that down into my design null and then drag my fracture object inside the cloner. With the cloner selected, I'm going to turn fix clone off so that doesn't change the orientation of the fracture. If I zero that and actually move it on the X, you can see that that's basically duplicating my design 3 times and it's moving it on a particular axis. We want to be able to put it on multiple axes. I want a clone above and to the sides and in these corners. And the easiest way of doing that is going to the mode here and selecting grid array. That's actually, there's lots of intersections happening at the moment because our size isn't big enough. We need our size to be 1920 because our design was 1920 wide. and we need the height to be 1080. We'll put it 1080 on the Z, see if that works. So that can be 0 because there's nothing being cloned on there. So what that's actually doing, it's cloning. If I extend this a bit further, you can actually see it's duplicating the design 3 times on the X and 3 times on the Z. And if I set my size to 1920, 1080, which is the size of my Illustrator board, then that's actually kind of duplicating that perfectly as a grid. So now we've got a design which has been extended, and we can actually get a lot more camera angles, which is really useful. The only other thing that we need to do is to make sure that instance mode, render instances, is on. The reason being is otherwise the cinema file will not play back in real time. It'll be quite difficult to work with because it would treat the fracture object as individual pieces rather than duplicates of the fracture itself. So just remember to keep that on. Now if we play that back, we've got lots of animation.
Now that your animation's looking great, in the next lesson, we're going to be setting up some cameras and create an edit using the stage object in Cinema 4D. I'll see you there.